The riding crop came down for the third time before anyone in that hallway understood what they were seeing. Adeline Croft had her back flat against the marble wall, both arms raised above her face, and the pale skin of her forearms was already marked. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't asked anyone to stop. She just stood there in a gray housekeeping dress and a white apron, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and took it. In front of her, in a champagne silk gown worth more than that maid earned in 2 years, Camilla Ashford drew her arm back again. "On your knees," she said, her voice cracking down the corridor. "Who do you think you are, putting your hands on a glass I was carrying in front of my guests?" Behind her, the ballroom doors had already swung open. 200 people in black tie were spilling into the hallway with their drinks still in their hands, and not one of them stepped forward. A senator looked down at his shoes. A hospital board chairman turned toward the window. Near the staircase, a woman lifted her phone and then thought better of it. This was the Marchetti house, and in the Marchetti house you learned fast that some things were safer not to have seen. The crop went up a 4th time. It never came down. A hand closed around the leather in midair, and the corridor went so quiet that everyone heard the small sound of the whip stopping. Enzo Marchetti was 34 years old. Black 3-piece suit, no tie, one button open at the collar. He hadn't raised his voice in 11 years, and he didn't need to now. He held the crop still, and he didn't look at his fiancée at all. "Let go," he said quietly, "before I forget what I promised my father." Camilla smiled. She was so certain of who she was in that house that she smiled before she even turned around. Then she turned. The smile came apart on her face, and the crop slipped out of her fingers and hit the marble. Enzo still didn't look at her. He was looking at the woman against the wall, at the arms she hadn't lowered yet, at the way she was breathing. He took off his jacket and put it over her shoulders, and 200 people watched the most feared man in Chicago cover a housekeeper with his own coat. Then he turned to face the hallway. Who gave permission for this? Nobody answered him. Nobody in that corridor knew that the woman shaking under his jacket had been in the house for only 11 days. Nobody knew why she'd reached for that glass, or what she'd sworn to a woman upstairs who couldn't afford to have anyone find out. And nobody, least of all Enzo Marchetti himself, knew that he'd met her once before, on a night he could barely remember, and that everything he thought he owed the world was about to be counted again from the beginning. If this kind of story stays with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to that hallway. His question hung suspended in the hallway, and no one reached out to pick it up. People looked down at the floor, out the windows, into the bottoms of their wine glasses. The senator cleared his throat as though he were about to say something, then thought better of it. A man near the back quietly stepped half a pace away, and the sound of his shoes against the stone floor was so distinct that everyone turned to look. In this house, people understood that there were moments when silence was safer than the truth, and there were other moments when silence was the answer itself. Camilla was the first to recover her voice. She adjusted her bracelet, drew a breath, and settled onto her face the smile she always wore at charity auctions, the kind of smile rehearsed through hundreds of photographs. "Darling," she said, her voice softer now, sweet again. "It's really nothing. That girl had the nerve to snatch a glass of wine out of my hand while I was entertaining guests, in front of everyone. You know how long I've been preparing for tonight." She lifted her chin slightly toward the woman standing against the wall. When servants don't know their place, someone has to remind them. Enzo didn't answer. He bent down, picked up the whip from the stone floor, and turned it over in his hand like a man examining an old possession he'd forgotten he still owned. The wooden handle was worn smooth, with a small crack running along the grain. He knew that crack well. He'd seen it throughout his childhood, inside the glass cabinet in his father's study, behind a pane that was never opened. Ambrose, the old butler, stepped forward, slowly but without the slightest hesitation, and held out both hands to receive it. "Put it in storage," Enzo said. "It's a keepsake from my father. It isn't something to be used for this." "Yes, Master Marchetti," Ambrose replied, and the way he addressed him made several people in the hallway subtly shift their posture. He'd served this house through 3 generations of masters, and he used that exact form of address only when everyone needed to be reminded who truly made the decisions here. Camilla watched as the whip was carried away. Something very brief passed across her face. Not shame, but the irritation of someone whose toy had just been taken from her. "You're making too much of this," she said. "Our guests are standing right here." "Our guests." Enzo repeated the 2 words without emphasis, without raising his voice, simply placing them in the middle of the hallway for everyone to hear. Then he turned his back on her. From the moment his hand had touched the strip of leather until now, he hadn't looked at her once. It wasn't because he'd forgotten. He'd chosen not to look. And Camilla, who had spent her entire life learning how to read rooms like this one, understood that later than everyone else standing there, the party will continue, Enzo said to the hallway. Please, go back inside. The wine has already been poured, and I don't want anyone leaving early because of me. A faint breath of relief moved through the crowd. A few people offered strained smiles, grateful to have been given a way out. Music began again in the main room. A gentle string piece, far too gentle for what had just happened. But before tonight is over, he added, his voice still as quiet as before, I'll know what really happened here. No one asked him to repeat himself. No one dared. The crowd dispersed, drifting back into the ballroom like water receding from the shore, leaving the hallway bare beneath the cold light spilling down from the hanging lamps. Adeline was still standing there, the suit jacket hanging too loosely over her shoulders, her arms finally lowered at her sides, and she realized they were trembling, not from the pain. She'd endured the pain. She was trembling because in this house, throughout the past 11 days, no one had ever stepped forward to stand in front of her. At the kitchen doorway, Bess Kowalczyk stood tucked behind the wooden frame, still clutching the tray of napkins she'd been holding all this time without even realizing it. Her eyes were red. She looked at Adeline for a long moment, opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally managed to say a single sentence, her voice breaking on the third word. I'm sorry. I was too scared to step out. Adeline looked at the girl, and what she did made Ambrose, standing at the far end of the hallway, pause for a beat. She didn't blame her. She didn't cry. She only gave a small nod and said, her voice hoarse but calm, I know. It's all right. Put the tray away and go into the kitchen where it's warm. Then she pulled her sleeves down over both forearms, as though she'd just remembered that some things were best kept from anyone's eyes. The small room beside the kitchen was normally used only to store table linens, and the things no one wanted to see in the ballroom. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a low-hanging light. Ambrose set the first aid kit on the table and pulled out a chair for her. Sit down. I've already sent someone to call the doctor. Please don't. Adeline said it at once, and for the first time that entire evening, there was something urgent in her voice. Please, don't trouble anyone over this. This isn't a small matter. I know. She sat down, placed both hands on the table, and began rolling up her sleeves. But if a doctor comes while the guests are still in the house, all of Chicago will know by tomorrow morning, and people won't tell the story the way you'd want them to. Ambrose didn't answer. He'd lived long enough in this house to know she was right. He simply opened the kit, pushed it toward her, then stepped back and folded his arms as he watched. Adeline looked inside for a second, then reached in and took out exactly what she needed, and nothing more. She arranged everything in a row on the table in the order she intended to use it. Gauze first, the roll of bandage afterward, the scissors placed at the far right. She washed her hands at the sink in the corner, scrubbing carefully between each finger, then shook them dry instead of wiping them on her apron. She snapped open the antiseptic ampule by tapping it lightly against the edge of the table, instead of using her teeth. Then she lowered her gaze to her forearms. There were 3 welts, one running diagonally near her wrist, the other 2 higher up, and where they crossed, the skin had split open for a short distance. She cleaned that area first, wiping from the center outward, using each piece of gauze only once before discarding it, never bringing it back over a place she'd already cleaned. She didn't flinch. She breathed out slowly and evenly as she worked, the breathing rhythm of someone accustomed to keeping her hands steady while some part of her body was in pain. Once the torn skin was clean, she placed a pad of gauze over it, held it in place with her thumb, and began wrapping the bandage. She wrapped upward from the wrist, the first turn overlapping itself to anchor it, each turn after that covering exactly half the width of the one before, so evenly that there wasn't a single wrinkle. When she reached the fuller part of her forearm, she rotated her wrist and folded the edge of the bandage at an angle, so it would follow the shape of her body, instead of slipping down. When she finished, she didn't tie a knot. She split the tail of the bandage lengthwise into 2 strips, wrapped them in opposite directions, then tied them together on the outer side, where movement wouldn't press against the knot. Then she did something Ambrose didn't understand at first. She raised her other hand, gently pressed the tip of one finger on the arm she'd just bandaged, held it for a moment, then released it, and watched her fingernail closely. She repeated the same thing with another finger. Then she gave the slightest nod, as though someone had just given her an answer, and moved on to the other arm. Ambrose remained silent from beginning to end. He'd seen many people bandage their own wounds over the course of his life. Gardeners pricked by thorns, kitchen workers cut by knives, and all of them wrapped bandages the same way. Cover the wound and tie it tight. The tighter the better because it made them feel safer. None of them ever stopped to press their own fingertips. None of them laid out their supplies in order before beginning. Only when she pulled her sleeves down to cover both bandages did he finally speak, and his voice was perfectly calm, as though he were asking about the weather. "Where did you learn to do that?" Adeline's hand stopped, only for a beat, so brief that if Ambrose hadn't been standing in exactly that place, at exactly that angle, he wouldn't have noticed. Then she looked up and smiled, and the smile was kind enough to almost hide the answer. "I just learned how to take care of myself," she said. "Out there, people have to learn that sort of thing." She closed the first aid kit, gathered the used pieces of gauze into her palm to throw them away, and wiped the table clean with her own napkin before standing. "Thank you. I'll go back and finish my work." "You don't have to. There are still trays of glasses in the main room. If they're left until morning, the wine stains will soak into the wood." And she walked out just as Ambrose caught sight of a shadow moving away from the hallway on the other side of the door, quietly, as though it had never been standing there at all. Enzo Marchetti had listened long enough. He'd heard the question. He'd heard the answer too. And as he walked toward the staircase, he found himself thinking about one very small thing he couldn't push out of his mind, that he'd questioned countless people in his life, and most of them lied to him by saying too much. That woman lied by saying less, and that was the kind of lie he'd never learned how to break. The last guest left the Marchetti house after the clock in the foyer had already struck past midnight. The tablecloths were rolled up, the chairs were stacked, some of the lights were turned off, and the house slowly returned to the silence that belonged to it. Adeline finished wiping down the trays of glasses in the main room, hung her apron on its hook. Then instead of heading toward the staircase that led down to the servants' quarters, she turned in the opposite direction. The glass veranda was at the far end of the east wing, a projecting room overlooking the lake, cold at this time of year and almost never used. Mrs. Rosaria Marchetti was sitting in a wicker chair with her back to the door. In front of her, on a small table, sat a glass of red wine that she had poured at some unknown hour and barely touched. Adeline pushed the door open with her shoulder, because both hands were carrying something else, and the old woman didn't turn around. She only spoke into the empty space before her. "I thought you'd gone to bed." "I thought you'd gone to bed too, ma'am." Adeline set a glass of warm water on the table, then did something so naturally that anyone watching would have found nothing unusual about it. She slid the wine glass out of the old woman's reach, placed the warm water exactly where the wine had been, and said nothing about it. Then she knelt beside the chair. "Mrs." Rosaria held out her hand, and Adeline took it, placing 3 fingertips against the inside of her wrist. She didn't speak. The old woman didn't speak either. The only sound in the glass veranda was the wind moving across the frozen lake below. Adeline stayed that way for a long time, far longer than any ordinary comforting touch. Her eyes lowered toward the floor and narrowed slightly as though she were counting something only she could hear. Then she released the woman's hand, pulled the shawl a little higher over her shoulders, and tucked the edge more securely around her neck. "It's colder out here than you think, ma'am. I've lived here since before you were born. I know how cold it gets out here." "Yes, ma'am, but knowing and enduring are 2 different things." "Mrs." Rosaria gave a dry little laugh. "You talk like someone I used to know." She reached for the glass of warm water without asking what had happened to the wine, took a small sip, then held the glass between her palms for the warmth. "My husband used to speak that way too, briefly, and as though he'd weighed every word before opening his mouth. I just don't say much, ma'am. It isn't because I think things through that carefully." "Oh, I know." The old woman looked down at her, and her gaze paused on Adeline's sleeve, where the fabric had been pulled lower than usual. She didn't ask. She only clicked her tongue softly, and in that small sound was a kind of anger that age had taught her to swallow. "Does it hurt badly?" "No, ma'am." "You're a terrible liar." "Yes, ma'am." Adeline nodded with complete seriousness. "But you're better at catching me than most people in this house, so I suppose it isn't entirely my fault." "Mrs." Rosaria stared at her for a second, then truly laughed, the sound ringing through the cold glass veranda and making the glass in her hands tremble. She laughed so hard she had to bring one hand to her chest, then shook her head and patted the back of Adeline's hand the way someone might soothe a granddaughter. "You girl." And in the doorway behind them, Enzo Marchetti stood perfectly still. He'd been passing by on his way back to his study and had stopped when he heard his mother's laughter, a sound he couldn't remember the last time he'd heard. He saw the woman kneeling on the veranda floor, her sleeves pulled down to cover everything, her head slightly bowed, and he didn't understand what he'd just witnessed. He didn't understand how someone who'd been in the house for only 11 days knew where his mother sat at this hour. He didn't understand why his mother, who had rejected an entire team of caregivers he'd hired himself, would allow a maid to kneel beside her without sending her away. He stepped forward half a pace, about to speak. And Mrs. Rosaria looked up. Her eyes met her son's through the darkness of the hallway, and she shook her head, very slightly, just once, almost too faint to see. But Enzo had received that shake of the head from his mother throughout his childhood, and he understood it better than any command he'd ever heard in his life. Don't ask. He stood there for one more beat. Then he turned away, and the sound of his shoes gradually faded across the stone floor, leaving behind 2 women and a glass of red wine that had been pushed out of reach without either of them bothering to mention it. The following afternoon, the oak door downstairs was closed, and in the Marchetti house, when that door was shut, no one walked through the hallway in front of it. Inside stood a long table large enough for 12 people, dark in color, worn smooth along both edges from too many hands resting there across 3 generations. There were no paintings on the walls, only a single black and white photograph of the man who had built everything represented by those now seated around the table. Enzo sat at the head. He wasn't wearing a tie, and he didn't open a notebook. Everyone else was older than he was, most of them much older, and every one of them had once sat in these very chairs listening to his father speak. The first to say anything was a silver-haired old man seated near the far end, his voice roughened by cigarettes. Word about last night is already out. There were 2 calls this morning asking after things. They were very polite about it, but you know what they really wanted to know. I know. The Ashford family is putting their name on papers where ours isn't allowed to appear. The old man continued. Their bank stands behind 3 of the cleanest businesses this house has. In an entire lifetime, we couldn't ask for what that marriage gives us for nothing. And yet last night, in front of 200 people, you took the side of a housemaid. A chair creaked. No one nodded, but no one objected either. Let me be clear, the old man said. I'm not defending Miss Ashford. I'm only asking whether it was worth it. Enzo hadn't yet answered when Ottavio Marchetti set his glass of water down on the table. He was his father's younger brother, the only man in the room who still remembered this house before the glass veranda had been built. And when he spoke, the entire table went silent. Was it worth it? Ottavio repeated the words, his voice still mild. You're asking the boy that question in this room? He looked slowly around the table. Last night, a woman was beaten in the hallway of our house. Beaten in front of 200 people, with something taken from my brother's glass cabinet, and you're sitting here asking one another whether stopping it was worth it. He lifted his water glass, then set it down again without drinking. If the boy had stood there and done nothing last night, I'd have been the one making calls this morning, and they wouldn't have been courtesy calls. The old man at the end of the table lowered his eyes to his hands. Ottavio turned toward Enzo, and his voice changed, warmer now, almost proud. You did the right thing. Anyone sitting at this table who doesn't understand that ought to take another look at where he's sitting. Thank you, Uncle, Enzo said. Then he placed both hands on the table and looked directly at the old man at the far end of the room. But I'll still answer your question. My father left this house one rule, and that rule has no exceptions. This house never lays a hand on someone who can't strike back. No one said anything. A few men nodded slowly and respectfully, the kind of nod given by men who had heard those words from another man's mouth a very long time ago and had never dared argue with them. That woman has nothing, Enzo continued. No money, no name, no one standing behind her. If we let what happened last night pass, then that rule becomes nothing more than a sentence people recite at funerals. I won't inherit a house like that. Ottavio nodded slowly, approving every word. He tapped the tabletop twice, lightly, as though bringing the meeting to a close. Then, just as everyone began pushing back their chairs to stand, he added one more sentence, so quietly that only Enzo and the man beside him heard it. Your father used to say the same thing. He picked up his coat and smiled. Then he was gone before he turned 60. The words fell onto the wooden table and remained there. Ottavio had already reached the door, still turning back to clap someone on the shoulder, still smiling, and no one in the room thought he'd said anything more than the sorrow of a younger brother remembering the dead. Enzo remained seated alone for a long time after the oak door closed. He reached his room when the sky beyond the lake had begun to lighten. That thin gray February light, not yet strong enough to be called dawn. He took off his coat, folded it, and laid it over the back of a chair. Ambrose entered, carrying the tea tray he always brought at that hour, set it on the table, then stopped. On the right cuff of Enzo's shirt was a dark stain, already dry, already soaked deep into the weave of the fabric. Ambrose looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then he picked up the coat from the chair, folded it neatly over his arm, and spoke in the same calm voice he used every other morning. I'll have this cleaned as well, Master Marchetti. Thank you. He walked out and closed the door behind him. No one asked. In this house, there were questions people had learned a very long time ago were best never asked. Adeline's shift ended at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the last bus that passed the intersection at the foot of the hill had left quite some time before. She'd known that from the moment she agreed to stay and clean up after the party, and she'd taken the shift anyway. As she crossed the foyer toward the back door, the stone floor behind her showed a trail of dark, wet footprints, each one clearly shaped like the sole of her foot, fading and then appearing again with every step. The soles of her shoes had worn through the previous fall. She cut pieces of cardboard to fit inside them, replaced the pieces every 2 days, and that worked well enough until the snow melted into water. Outside, the snowfall wasn't heavy, but the wind blew sideways, the kind of February wind coming off the lake that made people lower their heads as they walked. The road leading out of the estate stretched for a little more than 3 miles, bordered on both sides by fences and bare trees, and at this hour there was nothing there at all. No stores, no lights, no one. Adeline pulled up her collar, shoved both hands into her pockets, and started walking. She'd gone about half a mile when she heard an engine behind her. She walked several more steps before realizing that the sound wasn't getting any closer, but it wasn't falling farther behind either. It was keeping the same distance. She glanced back exactly once. A black car was moving very slowly, its headlights off. She didn't stop. She didn't walk faster either. She only tightened her grip on the strap of her bag and kept going, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, thinking about something the past few years had taught her, that people only ran when they still believed they could get away. The car followed her like that for nearly a mile. Then, at the intersection where a broken traffic light blinked yellow, a second car appeared from the cross street, dark-colored as well, moving without any hurry, and stopped directly in the middle of the intersection, blocking the way. Both cars remained still. No one honked. No doors opened. No one spoke. There was only the sound of 2 engines idling in the night, and the blinking yellow light sweeping across both hoods. Adeline stopped at the side of the road, and in those moments, she could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. About a minute passed. Then the first car backed up, turned around, and drove back the way it had come. The second car remained in the intersection until she disappeared around the bend. Then it left too. Adeline never looked back again. She reached the boarding house beside the highway while the sky was still completely dark. Outside her room, she stopped, set down her bag, and pulled both sleeves as far down as they would go, until the fabric covered her wrists completely, and only her fingertips remained visible. She took a breath. Then she forced a smile onto her face and opened the door. Josie was sitting propped against the headboard, the blanket pulled up to her chest, the bedside lamp still on. She was 19 years old, thinner than she'd been in the summer, and she stayed awake every time her sister came home late, no matter how many times she'd been scolded for it. "You walked again, didn't you? The bus left early tonight. You said that last week. Then I suppose it left early again this week." Adeline hung her coat on the hook, went to the sink, turned on the hot water, and held both hands beneath the stream. "I got extra hours. They pay more for the shift after a party. We're covered this month." Josie was silent for a moment. Covered for the rent? Or for that too? Both. It was the second lie in less than a minute, and Adeline said it so calmly that she almost believed it herself. She poured a glass of warm water, carried it over, set it on the small table beside her sister's bed, then sat down on the edge of the mattress. The old electric heater in the room was running at full power, and the air had been stifling for a long time. Josie looked at the long sleeves covering her sister's arms. "Why don't you roll those up? It's boiling in here." Adeline smiled. "I'm still cold from being outside. I haven't warmed up yet." "You've been inside for a while." "Then I stay cold a little longer than most people." Josie looked at her for one more second. She didn't ask again. She'd learned a long time ago that there were questions which, if asked twice, only forced the other person to lie again, and she loved her sister enough not to make her do that. She only said very softly, "Go to sleep. You have to get up early again tomorrow." Adeline turned off the bedside lamp. She lay down on the bed beside hers, and in the darkness, she carefully rested both arms across her stomach, instead of letting them fall at her sides, because that way the bandages didn't press against anything. In the other bed, Josie turned her face toward the wall. She lay still for a long time, and after a while, her hand slipped beneath the pillow and touched an envelope that had been written long ago, folded into quarters, its edges worn soft from so many nights of being touched, and then left there again. She didn't take it out. She only kept her hand there until she drifted to sleep. Adeline was at the back door of the Marchetti house before the sky had fully brightened. She arrived ahead of her scheduled shift, because the morning after a major event was always the hardest, And because if she came late, someone would say she was using what had happened the night before last as an excuse. She hung up her coat, tied on her apron, pulled both sleeves down low, then fastened the cuffs securely. Bess was already standing in the kitchen, looking at her with the expression of someone who wanted to say something but didn't know where to begin. So Adeline simply handed her a cleaning cloth and said, "Start with the row of glasses on the left. Those already have marks on them." Then the two of them worked in silence. Near noon, while Adeline was wiping down the banister of the grand staircase, Ambrose appeared on the landing above. He didn't call out to her. He simply stood there until she looked up. "Miss Croft, come up here for a moment." She climbed the stairs, still holding the cloth in her hand. He handed her a white envelope, thicker than she'd expected. "Your pay for the post-party shift. It includes the overtime from that night." Adeline took it, and for a second she meant to say thank you, put it away, and leave the matter there. But she'd counted too much money in her life not to recognize the weight of an envelope. She opened it, looked inside, then raised her eyes. "Sir, there's too much here." "That's right. I only worked until 2 o'clock in the morning. I didn't do anything extra to earn more than that." "I didn't say you did anything extra." He stood straight with both hands clasped behind his back, and he had no intention of explaining himself. "I've been paying wages in this house since before you were born. No one has ever caught me making a mistake." Adeline looked at the envelope in her hand. She thought about the little table beside Josie's bed, about the bill lying beneath the glass of water, about the way the girl had turned her face toward the wall the night before. She thought very quickly and very carefully. Then she folded the envelope closed and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. "Thank you. You don't need to thank me," he said. Then he looked down at the cuffs of her sleeves, where the fabric had been pulled low and buttoned tightly, and his voice dropped by a degree, low enough that anyone standing 3 steps away wouldn't have heard him. "Keep your sleeves like that." Adeline went still. "In this house," Ambrose said, "people who know how to stay quiet usually live longer." A very brief silence passed between them, and in that silence Adeline could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the foyer below and the sound of running water coming from the kitchen. She tightened her grip around the cleaning cloth. "What do you know?" she asked. He didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a long time, the look of a man weighing whether he should place one more card on the table. "I know," he said, "that you aren't a housemaid." Adeline couldn't manage another question. Her throat went dry, and she realized both hands were squeezing the cloth so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Dozens of questions rushed through her mind at once. How much did he know? How long had he known? Had he told anyone? And whose side was he on? But she didn't have time to ask any of them. Ambrose gave a slight nod, the courteous nod he always used to bring conversations in this house to an end, then turned and started down the stairs. Halfway down, he stopped without looking back. "There are guests in the small parlor at noon. Have Bess bring up the tea. You don't go into that room." Then he continued on, the steady sound of his shoes gradually fading away, and he didn't explain another word. Adeline remained on the landing for a long time after he'd disappeared from sight. She raised a hand and touched the envelope in her apron pocket. It was still there, thick and warm, and now it carried an entirely different kind of weight. She didn't know whether she'd just been helped or warned. She didn't know whether that man had just reached out a hand to steady her or slipped a rope around her neck that she hadn't yet felt tighten. And the most frightening part was that she understood that in the Marchetti house, those two things often looked exactly the same. Nash Kettering didn't knock on the study door. He never had to. He walked in, set a thin file on the desk in front of Enzo, then stepped back and stood there with his arms at his sides, the posture of a man who had just delivered something he knew he wouldn't be thanked for. "You told me to look into her." "I did." "Then here it is." Enzo opened the file. The first page was a photocopy, the print small. The seal in the upper left corner faded from having passed through too many machines. In the middle of the page was a name he'd already seen on his own household payroll, Adeline Croft. Beneath it was another line, longer, listing her former position, emergency room nurse at a major hospital in Cleveland. And farther down, in the findings section, was the sentence Nash had marked with a faint pencil line beside it so Enzo wouldn't have to search. Nursing license revoked. Reason: falsification of medication administration records. Enzo read the entire page. Then he turned to the next, and the one after that. There was no appeal, no attorney, not a single line recording any statement from the person who had been accused. There were only the date the hearing began, the date the ruling was issued, and an empty space where her voice should have been. "How long ago?" he asked. 4 years, Nash said. "She hasn't gone back into the profession since. Worked different jobs, mostly temporary. She came to this house through a domestic staffing agency. The application they submitted was for housekeeping, and there was nothing false in it because they never asked about this part and she didn't disclose it. Enzo closed the file and rested his hand on top of it. You want me to handle it now? No, he said. Send her up. Adeline arrived at the study with her hands still damp from washing the last row of dishes. She wiped them on her apron before stepping inside, stopped about 3 paces from the desk, and didn't sit because no one had invited her to. Enzo pushed the file into the middle of the desk and turned it so she could read it. He didn't say anything. He let her see for herself. Adeline looked down. She only looked for about 3 seconds, long enough to see her name and the line marked in pencil. Then she raised her eyes, and the remarkable thing was that her face didn't go pale. There was no panic, no frantic glance searching for a way out. There was something much closer to exhaustion, like someone hearing a song she'd already heard too many times. Is it true? Enzo asked. Yes, sir. Your license was revoked. Yes. For falsifying medication administration records. Yes. He waited. He'd sat behind this desk long enough to know exactly what came after the third yes. People began explaining. They said there was a detail the paperwork didn't mention, that something had happened that night, that if he'd only listened from the beginning, he'd understand. He'd heard hundreds of people do exactly that in this very room, and he knew how to peel away each layer until he reached what was true. But Adeline didn't say anything else. She stood there with her hands folded in front of her apron and remained silent. The silence lasted long enough to become an answer of its own. You're not going to say anything? You've already read it, sir. I read a piece of paper, and what's written on that paper is true. Enzo stood up. He rarely stood in the middle of a conversation, and Nash, waiting in the corner of the room, shifted his weight slightly. Do you understand where you're standing? He said. There are 7 people in this house with keys to the medicine cabinet. My mother is upstairs. Someone has just handed me a document saying you were once barred from practicing because of medication records. And you stand here, nod 3 times, and leave it at that. Yes, you're not even going to say one thing in your own defense? Adeline looked at him, and for the first time during the entire conversation, something passed through her eyes, very quickly, and then was gone. What good would it do? She replied. People have believed that piece of paper for 4 years. Then she raised her hands, untied the apron from around her waist, and began folding it, neatly, smoothing each edge flat, exactly the way she always folded table linens. If you want me gone, I'll finish today's shift first. I've only cleaned half of the east hallway floor. If it's left until this afternoon, it'll dry unevenly and be harder to clean again. And it was that sentence, not the file, that made Enzo Marchetti angry. He couldn't understand it. He'd spent his entire life facing people willing to lie, beg, threaten, do anything at all to hold on to their place. And this woman was standing in front of him, folding her apron until it lay perfectly flat, without even bothering to fight for a single chance for herself. Get out, he said. She nodded, placed the folded apron on the edge of the desk, and walked out. The door closed very softly behind her. Nash stayed silent for a moment before speaking. You want me to fire her? Enzo looked at the apron on the edge of the desk, folded square and smooth, and he didn't answer. The apron was still lying exactly where she'd left it on the edge of the desk when the study door opened for the second time. This time there was no knock, only the slow, steady tap of a cane against the wooden floor, and Nash immediately stepped out of the room without needing to be told. Mrs. Rosaria came in, didn't sit in the chair her son pulled out for her, and rested both hands on the top of her cane. I just heard people saying you sent that girl away. I haven't sent anyone away, but you're thinking about it. She looked down at the neatly folded apron on the edge of the desk, and something in her eyes hardened. Do you know why she was beaten? Because she took the wine glass out of Camilla's hand while she was entertaining guests. No, Mrs. Rosaria said. Camilla was handing that glass to me. Enzo looked up. Do you understand now? Camilla carried that glass across half the room, slowly enough for everyone to see, then offered it to me in front of all those guests, so people could watch the future daughter-in-law of the Marchetti family taking care of her mother-in-law. She even waited until Mrs. Whitfield turned to look before she held it out. She lifted her cane, then set it down again, and I was about to take it. Enzo said nothing. At some point, without realizing it, he'd sat down. I'm taking blood thinners, she said, and she said it as calmly as though she were reading a line from a grocery list. I've been taking them since last spring. When you're on that medication, you don't touch alcohol. Do you understand? It isn't a matter of avoiding it, because it's healthier. You simply can't have it. A very long silence settled over the study. I'd already told her, Mrs. Rosaria continued. Twice. The first time was at Thanksgiving, when she poured wine for the whole table. The second was that afternoon, just before the guests arrived. I told her I couldn't drink wine, and if she wanted to help, She could pour me plain water with a slice of lemon in it. It would still look nice, and no one would know. And then what? She laughed. Mrs. Rosaria said. She told me, Mother, one glass isn't going to kill anyone. Everyone is watching. If you stand there holding plain water all evening, you'll look pathetic. Enzo raised one hand to his face, then lowered it again. She wasn't trying to hurt me, Mrs. Rosaria said, and there was no anger in her voice, only weariness. Don't think that. She didn't mean anything cruel by it. She simply didn't believe that what was happening to me mattered as much as the fact that people were watching her. To her, I was only part of the scenery for her evening. And don't argue with me, because that's more frightening than malice. Then what did Adeline do? The girl was 3 steps away, collecting dirty glasses, she said. I saw her look at the glass, then she looked at me. Then she stepped forward and took it from Camilla's hand before my fingers touched it, and said out loud that there was a lipstick mark on the rim, and she'd bring me another one. Then she turned away quickly. She looked at her son. In front of 200 people, a housemaid had just taken a glass out of Camilla Ashford's hand and ruined her little performance. That was all. Enzo sat perfectly still. Then why didn't she say so? He asked, and his voice had gone rough. In the hallway, when I asked, she only had to say one sentence. Mrs. Rosaria was silent for a long moment. Because I made her swear. His head snapped up. I made her swear that very evening, while she was collecting glasses in the corner of the room, before any of it happened, she said. I took her hand and told her that no one in this house was to know about my medication. No one. Not even you. Especially not you. Why would you do that? Because I watched you bury your father, she said. And I watched you keep living afterward. I don't want to see that look on your face one more time before I die. Enzo stood, walked to the window, and stopped there with his back to her. That girl had only been in this house for 11 days, Mrs. Rosaria said behind him. She didn't owe me anything. She could have opened her mouth in that hallway that night and ended the whole thing immediately. All she had to do was reveal the illness of an old woman she'd known for 11 days. She struck the tip of her cane against the floor once. She stood against that wall and kept silent. Enzo. She chose to keep her promise to me. And this morning, you called her up here, pushed a piece of paper across the desk, and asked her why she wouldn't defend herself. Enzo didn't turn around. He looked down at the frozen lake below, and for a very long time, he couldn't find a single word to say. That file sat on the desk in the study for only one afternoon. But it wasn't the only copy. By the following afternoon, Camilla Ashford had in her hands exactly what Nash Kettering had uncovered. And she didn't need to invent a single word. She only needed to tell it her way. She didn't make any announcement. She did it in the spaces between other conversations, while pouring more tea, while seeing guests to the door, while walking arm in arm with another woman through the gallery. She spoke in the voice of someone deeply troubled by having to say anything at all. I don't even want to tell you this, but you're my friend, and you do leave your handbag in the sitting room. Then she sighed. That new girl used to work in a hospital. She was dismissed. It had something to do with medication. That's all I'm going to say. You can understand the rest for yourself. There was no accusation in any of it. No one could point to a single sentence and call it slander. But by the end of the week, the story had traveled much farther than anything she'd actually said. It moved through drawing rooms, down into the kitchen, out into the servants' quarters, and every time it was repeated, another layer was added. People supplied details no one had verified and no one bothered to verify, because a story like that was far more satisfying to hear than the truth. Adeline knew what was happening before anyone said a word to her. She knew it from the sound of locks turning. She walked past the upstairs dressing room, and the linen supervisor reached out, shut the small cabinet where medications were kept, then turned the key, making it look casual, as though she locked it every day. That afternoon, in the west hallway, someone else did exactly the same thing. Then another person. No one looked her directly in the eyes. People still greeted her, still asked her to fetch this or that, still thanked her politely. The only difference was that now, whenever she entered a room, some hand would quietly reach out and some cabinet door would quietly close. By the servants' dinner, everything had become too obvious to require guessing. Adeline carried her tray to the long table in the kitchen and noticed that the 2 chairs to her left were empty, and so were the 2 to her right. It wasn't that people stood up and walked away when she sat down. They had simply chosen other seats before she arrived and arranged themselves so there would always be just enough distance between her and them that no one could be accused of being rude. She ate in silence, her eyes on her bowl, her back straight. Then a chair scraped beside her. Bess Kowalczyk set down her tray, dropped into the empty chair directly next to Adeline, and pulled it a little closer, making sure the sound was loud enough to be heard. She didn't say anything. She didn't look at anyone. She simply lowered her head and ate, and halfway through the meal, she used her fork to pick up the slice of apple pie from her own tray, the only good thing served that evening, and pushed the whole piece onto Adeline's plate. Then she went on eating as though nothing had happened. Adeline looked at the pie on her plate. She didn't thank her. She understood that thanking her would turn what Bess had just done into an act of pity, and that wasn't what the girl wanted. She only pushed the salt toward Bess, and the two of them finished dinner side by side at a long table surrounded by empty chairs. It wasn't until they were washing dishes that Bess finally spoke, her voice low and angry. "Why don't you say anything?" "Say what?" "Say it wasn't you. Tell people the truth." I heard the linen supervisor telling the story, and she had half of it wrong. She was adding things that never even happened. Bess set a plate down hard in the sink. "Go tell every single one of them." "I'll go with you." Adeline smiled and kept scrubbing the pot in her hands. "And then what?" "Then they'll know you didn't do anything." They'll nod, then turn away, and the next evening they'll tell the same story all over again to someone who hasn't heard it yet. She rinsed the pot and turned it upside down on the rack. "A rumor only stays alive when it finds somewhere to shelter, Bess. If I stand up and argue with every sentence, then I've given it a place to stay. If I spend my life chasing every lie, I won't have any time left to live decently." "But that's so unfair." "Yes," Adeline said. "It is." She dried her hands on her apron, then gave the girl a gentle pat on the shoulder. "But you sat down beside me in front of that whole table tonight. Do you know what you did?" Bess looked up, confused. "You just took away one of its places to hide." Then she picked up the stack of clean plates and carried them toward the cabinet, leaving the girl standing there with both hands still wet. And for the first time all week, Bess Kowalczyk found herself standing a little straighter. The story Camilla had set loose didn't stop inside the house. It only needed to travel a little farther, and she knew exactly where it needed to go. The call took place one afternoon, brief and impeccably polite. She introduced herself as the event coordinator for a prominent family in the area, said she only wanted to mention something out of a sense of responsibility, that one of the tenants staying there had once been involved in a medication-related matter and had been formally disciplined by a professional board, that she didn't want to interfere in anyone else's business, but if she were the landlord, she would wonder whether the other tenants were safe. Then she thanked him and hung up. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't need to. The next morning, the landlord knocked on Adeline's door just after she'd finished changing for work. He wouldn't look her in the eyes. He said he was very sorry, that it wasn't personal, that he had to think about the other tenants too, and that she had until the end of the day. Adeline asked him for one more week. She told him she'd paid everything she owed, that she'd never been late by even a single day, and that her sister had a treatment appointment the day after tomorrow. She only needed 1 week to find somewhere else. The man looked down at his feet and said he would have to change the lock by that afternoon. The sisters packed their belongings before noon. There wasn't much to pack. Adeline called 3 places. The first was full. The second wanted a deposit equal to an entire month's wages. The third didn't answer. That night, the 2 sisters slept somewhere Adeline would never tell anyone about. February near the lake showed mercy to no one. Josie didn't make it to her treatment appointment the following day. It wasn't because she didn't want to go. It was because there was no longer any way to get there from where they were. And because while Adeline was running from place to place trying to find somewhere for them to stay, she'd miscalculated one bus connection, and one missed bus in February could cost an entire day. By the following afternoon, Josie had started breathing heavily. By evening, she couldn't sit up anymore. Adeline called an ambulance, and she sat in the hospital corridor all night with her thin coat spread across her knees, listening to the automatic doors open and close, and she didn't shed a single tear. By morning, they told her the girl was stable, that she'd made it through this time, and that next time she mustn't miss another treatment. Adeline thanked them. Then she went back to the Marchetti house and reported for her shift on time. No one in the house knew what the past 2 days had been like for her. She wiped down the stair railing, replaced the linens in the sitting rooms, carried dirty laundry to the basement. She did everything exactly as she did every other day. Near noon, she carried the last basket of linens down to the laundry room, closed the door behind her, and stood there. The laundry room was the only place in the house where there was constant noise. 3 machines ran at once, water rushing, drums turning, hot air pushing through the vents. Adeline set the basket on the floor. Then she straightened, and something inside her broke. She brought both hands over her mouth. She did it before the first sob could escape, pressing her hands so hard against her face that her fingertips turned white. Her shoulders began to shake. She backed away until her spine touched the side of a washing machine, then slowly slid down and collapsed onto the tile floor between baskets of dirty linens. Her head bowed between her knees, and she cried like that without making a sound, inside the roar of the machines she had carefully chosen because she knew they would swallow everything. She cried for the past 2 days, for the landlord staring down at his feet, for the bus she'd miscalculated, for her sister's face inside the ambulance, for the promise she'd made that they had enough this month. She cried because she'd pushed herself beyond exhaustion, and all that effort still hadn't been enough to keep a roof over the two of them for even one February night. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting there. On the other side of the door, Enzo Marchetti stood perfectly still. He'd come down to the basement looking for Ambrose, and he'd stopped when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the machines. He stood there with one hand resting on the doorknob, and he didn't turn it. He'd entered many rooms in his life. He'd walked into rooms where people stopped breathing when he appeared. He knew exactly what would happen if he opened this door. The woman inside would spring to her feet, wipe her face, apologize for letting the master of the house see her like that, and pick up the laundry basket. She would lose this place too, the last place she had left. He took his hand away from the doorknob. He went upstairs, poured a cup of hot tea himself in the kitchen, then came back down. He set it on the tile floor directly outside the laundry room door, lowering it so gently that the saucer didn't make a sound. Then he left. He didn't say a word, and he didn't look back. That afternoon, the tea had gone cold, and someone had taken the cup away to be washed, and Enzo Marchetti sat in his study with the file he'd closed and pushed aside several days earlier. He opened it again. He had someone call the hospital in Cleveland and got nothing. Human Resources said they didn't provide information about former employees. The call was transferred 3 times before someone finally said that all inquiries had to be submitted in writing. Nash made a trip there and came back empty-handed, and he told Enzo that places like that had laws of their own, that once a matter had been closed, no one wanted to open it again for a stranger wearing an expensive watch. If he wanted to know more, he'd have to find another way in. Enzo found another way. He didn't contact the hospital again. He had someone obtain the complete public record of the hearing before the state medical board, something anyone had the right to request a copy of, though almost no one ever bothered. It arrived the following evening, thicker than he'd expected, printed on thin paper. He sat alone in the study and read it from beginning to end, and he read it the way he read everything, which meant he wasn't looking at what people had written down. He was looking at what they'd left blank. The incident had happened during a night shift in the emergency department. A medication dose had been entered incorrectly in the record. The error was discovered before there were serious consequences. The patient survived, but the record was altered afterward, and it was the alteration that caused the case to be brought before the board. The name attached to the altered record was Adeline Croft. She accepted responsibility for everything. She admitted she'd entered the dose incorrectly. She admitted she'd changed the record. Enzo turned to the procedural section, and he stopped at a single line tucked neatly between 2 others, printed in the same size type, without emphasis, without any note beside it. The respondent declined legal counsel. The respondent declined to make a statement. He read that line 3 times. Then he stood, walked to the door, and called for Ambrose. The old butler entered the room, and Enzo pushed the page toward him and pointed to the line. "Read this." Ambrose put on his glasses and bent down to read it. "You've worked in this house longer than I've been alive," Enzo said. "How many rooms have you sat in with lawyers?" "More than I care to remember, Master Marchetti." "Have you ever seen anyone stand before a board with the power to take away their entire profession and refuse a lawyer?" Ambrose removed his glasses. "Never. Neither have I," Enzo said. "Someone might not be able to afford an attorney, but in hearings like this, counsel can be appointed without charge." She refused it. Someone might be too frightened to speak, but the transcript says she answered every question about what she'd done clearly and directly. She refused only one thing. She refused to make a statement. He placed his finger on the line. "No one refuses to defend themselves, Ambrose. Not unless they're defending someone else." Ambrose stood silent for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "Find out who else was in that department that night." It took 2 days. The staffing roster wasn't part of the public record, but the list of licensed personnel was, and so were license renewal applications, and Enzo had people cross-reference them until they narrowed it down to one name: Marisol Vega. Same department, same period of time. And what made Enzo stop for a long while was something else. The records showed that the woman had repeatedly applied for shift changes throughout that winter, asking to move from nights to days, and every request had been denied. People didn't ask to leave the night shift simply because they were tired. They asked when there was someone at home who couldn't be left alone at night. He dug further, and he found an address entry, and on that line was the number of people in the household. Not 1, 3. "She's a single mother," Enzo said. 2 children at home. Ambrose said nothing. If that case had been pushed into criminal prosecution, Enzo continued slowly, as though setting each brick carefully into place, then the person who entered the wrong dose would have lost her license, lost her job, and might have lost the right to remain with her 2 children. But if the person who took responsibility was younger, unmarried, with no one depending on her, then the board would treat it as professional discipline. License revoked. No prosecution. No one loses their children. He closed the hearing transcript. She didn't alter the record to protect herself, Ambrose, he said. She altered it so the other woman's name wouldn't be there anymore. Then she stood before the board and refused to say a single word in her own defense, because the moment she opened her mouth, everything she'd just done would fall apart. The study remained silent for a long time. 4 years, Enzo said. For 4 years, she let the whole world believe a piece of paper. And a few days ago, I sat right here at this desk, pushed that same paper in front of her, and asked her why she wouldn't defend herself. The hospital board fundraiser had been on the Marchetti household calendar since the previous fall, and it couldn't be postponed. Tables were set up in the grand hall, flowers were brought in, and a small podium was placed at the front of the room for several brief speeches. Mrs. Rosaria came downstairs because she attended every year, and because she said that if she didn't, people would start talking. Adeline moved between the tables with a tray in her hands, her sleeves pulled down as they were every day. It happened in the middle of the second speech. Mrs. Rosaria was standing near the foot of the staircase, one hand resting on the top of her cane, when she raised the other hand and touched her chest. That was all. She didn't cry out. The woman beside her turned and asked if she was all right, and before she could answer, the tip of her cane slipped across the stone floor, and she collapsed. A glass shattered. Then the entire hall seemed to break apart at once. People shoved their chairs back and stood. Voices rose. Someone shouted for a doctor. And the absurd thing was that there were 7 doctors in that room, holding glasses of wine, yet the first person to reach her was a man who dropped to his knees, shook her by the shoulders, and called her name louder and louder. Adeline set her tray down on the nearest table. She didn't run. She pushed through the crowd with her shoulders and elbows, and when she reached them, she said exactly 4 words to the man shaking the old woman. Please move out of the way. He looked up as though he meant to protest. And then he moved, because there was something in her voice that didn't allow anyone to do otherwise. Adeline knelt on the stone floor. She lowered her ear close, her eyes following the rise and fall of Mrs. Rosaria's chest, and remained that way for several seconds. Then she snapped her head up and pointed at a man standing frozen 2 steps away. Call an ambulance now. Tell them she's elderly, unconscious, and not breathing normally. She pointed to someone else. Go to the front door, open it, wait for them, and bring them straight in here. Don't let them go around the house. Then she loosened Mrs. Rosaria's collar, placed one hand over the other in the center of her chest, locked her fingers together, and began compressions. She drove her weight downward from her shoulders rather than her elbows, arms straight, the rhythm steady and fast, and she counted aloud so no one would interrupt. Around the 10th compression, the fabric over both of her forearms slipped down, and the entire room saw the 2 layers of white bandages wrapped from her wrists almost to her elbows. No one said anything. No one dared. The woman in a housemaid's uniform was kneeling in the middle of the hall, and 200 people in evening clothes stood in a circle around her, looking down, and not one of them stepped in. She continued the compressions. She tilted Mrs. Rosaria's head back, lifted her chin, gave 2 breaths, then started again. Sweat ran down Adeline's temple. She didn't miss a single beat. The ambulance siren could be heard coming up the drive by the time she reached the 4th round. 2 uniformed paramedics rushed in carrying a hard case and a machine, and the one in front called out, "How long has she been down?" Adeline kept compressing, never lifting her head, and answered in one continuous stream, her voice loud, clear, without stumbling over a single word. Less than 3 minutes. The collapse was witnessed. Chest compressions have been continuous since then. No interruptions. She's taking blood thinners every day and has been for several months. You need to consider internal bleeding. She's also on blood pressure medication. Don't give her anything intended to stop bleeding until you've spoken to the physician who prescribed her medication. The man froze for half a second, then nodded, and immediately repeated what he'd heard to his partner. They moved her aside so they could attach the electrodes, and she backed away on her knees without standing, still kneeling there as her hands began to tremble now that she had stopped. One beep, then another. Then someone said, "We have a pulse." The entire hall exhaled at once. They carried Mrs. Rosaria out, and for a long stretch of time, the sound of the stretcher wheels rolling over the stone floor was the only sound in the room. Adeline remained kneeling in the middle of the hall among the broken pieces of glass, her hair slipping loose from its bun, her sleeves fallen back to expose the 2 layers of bandages now damp with sweat. She bent down, gathered the shards of glass near her into her palm so no one would step on them, and only then did she rise. And she stood there before 200 people who had just watched her pull a life back from the edge, and not one of them knew what to say to her. Enzo Marchetti stood not far away. He'd been there from the moment she dropped to her knees, and he hadn't moved. He watched her hands stacked one over the other, watched the way she drove down from her shoulders, watched the steady rhythm of her counting that never once faltered. And somewhere very deep inside him, something flashed into existence and vanished again in half a second. A blinding white ceiling, a harsh light streaking across his vision, and a woman's voice very close to him calling his name over and over, telling him to open his eyes. Then it was gone. He stood perfectly still, his heart stumbling out of rhythm for a beat, and he didn't understand why. At the far end of the hall, a woman in a silk gown stood watching everything that had just happened. Camilla Ashford didn't come closer. She only looked at those bandaged hands, looked at the crowd staring after her, and in her mind, one small question had formed and remained there. The woman who had just done all of that in the middle of the Marchetti Hall was a woman who had been barred from practicing. Enzo returned home from the hospital close to midnight. They told him his mother had made it through, that she would need to remain there for several days, that if they had been even a few minutes later, the outcome would have been different. He didn't ask another question. He drove home, went straight upstairs to his study, and didn't turn on the main lights. He stood for a long time in front of the wall behind his desk, where a paneled section concealed the old safe that had belonged to his father. He couldn't remember the last time he'd opened it. There wasn't much inside, a few folders of papers, an envelope yellowed with age, his father's signet ring resting in a leather box, something Enzo had never worn because he'd always believed he hadn't earned the right. And beside that leather box, lying slightly off to one side as though someone had once pushed it away and then put it back, was a small metal object. He picked it up. It was a small watch, the kind pinned to the front of a uniform, its face turned upside down so the person wearing it could glance down and read the time. The outer rim had tarnished. The hands had stopped long ago. He remembered how it had come into his house. 4 years earlier, his men had taken him to an emergency department under a name that wasn't his, because things had happened that night that couldn't be allowed to appear in any record. He remembered only scattered fragments, a white ceiling, the smell of antiseptic, and the sensation of drifting away very slowly until everything stopped. When he woke the following day, someone returned a plastic bag containing his personal belongings, and mixed among his things was one object that didn't belong to him. Ambrose had been the one to open the bag. He'd picked up the small watch, examined it, and asked whether he should throw it away, because it wasn't Enzo's and there was no reason to keep it. Enzo had been lying in the hospital bed, speaking in the rough, damaged voice left over from the night before, and he'd said only one sentence: "No, this family doesn't throw away something we haven't repaid." Then he'd told Ambrose to put it in the safe beside his father's ring, and he hadn't opened that safe again for 4 years. Now he stood beneath the desk lamp and turned the watch over. The metal back was smooth and heavily scratched, and near the lower edge were 2 initials engraved by machine, small and faded, the kind people had engraved so their belongings wouldn't be mixed up in a department with dozens of employees. A and C. Enzo stood perfectly still. He didn't put it down. He simply stood there with the watch resting in his palm, and in his mind there wasn't a thought at all, only the image of 2 hands stacked together in the middle of his hall that afternoon, pressing down, steady, unwavering, and a woman's voice counting aloud so no one would interrupt. The same voice, the same rhythm. You found it. Ambrose was standing in the doorway. He wasn't carrying a tray. He hadn't brought tea. He was simply standing there, and he'd been there for some time. Enzo turned around. You knew. Yes, Master Marchetti. For how long? Since before she ever set foot in this house. Enzo placed the watch on the desk very gently. Tell me. Ambrose stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Mrs. Marchetti called me upstairs last fall, he said. She told me she needed me to find someone. She gave me a piece of paper with a name written on it. She said that on that night, she'd stood in the hospital corridor for hours, and the only person who came out to speak with her, the only person willing to sit beside her and hold her hand, was one of the nurses working the night shift. She said she'd asked the young woman her name, and she'd remembered that name for 4 years. Enzo couldn't say anything. It took me almost a year to find her, Ambrose said. It wasn't easy. She'd moved several times, worked nothing but temporary jobs, and never kept the same telephone number for more than a few months. When I finally found her, she was working 2 jobs at once and still couldn't make enough to live on. Why didn't my mother tell me? She forbade me to, Ambrose said. She said that if you knew, you'd repay the debt the way this family always does. You'd give her money, or a job, or both. And she said that if someone like Miss Croft accepted that kind of favor, she'd spend the rest of her life standing beneath you and would never be able to lift her head again. He paused. Your mother wanted her to have a job she could walk into on her own 2 feet, so she hired her through the domestic agency. Yes, the contract was under the agency's name. The Marchetti name never appeared anywhere in the hiring documents. It only said a private household in Lake Forest. Ambrose looked down at the watch on the desk. She had no idea who she was coming to work for, Master Marchetti. She only realized after she was already standing in the foyer and saw the photograph hanging on the wall. Enzo closed his eyes. He thought about that first morning, something he hadn't even been there to witness, and he pictured a woman standing in the middle of his foyer with a bag in her hand, realizing where she was and choosing to stay. 11 days, he said. Yes, and in those 11 days, I managed to push a piece of paper across a desk at her and ask whether she was a medication thief. Ambrose didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Enzo picked up the watch again, and this time he closed his hand around it so tightly that the edge of the metal pressed into his skin. His entire life, he'd lived by one very simple rule, that every debt had to be repaid, and he'd settled every debt anyone had ever entered into his ledger. There was only one he'd never been able to repay, because for 4 years he hadn't known whose name belonged beside it. Now he knew, and that person had been inside his house, scrubbing the floor of the east hallway, eating alone at a long table surrounded by empty chairs, and sitting in his laundry room crying where no one could hear her. About half an hour after Ambrose left, there was a knock at the study door. That alone was unusual, because in all those years, Nash Kettering had never knocked. Enzo told him to come in. Nash walked up to the desk, didn't sit down, didn't offer a greeting, and placed a small object on the wooden surface before pushing it toward Enzo with 2 fingers. It was the family ring, the ring every man accepted into this house was given, and the ring none of them ever removed from his hand while he was still alive. What's this? Enzo asked. I gave the file to Miss Ashford, Nash said. He said it quickly, like a man who'd been holding his breath for too long. A copy, the whole thing. I gave it to her 2 days after I put it on your desk. Enzo didn't move. He didn't pick up the ring. He only looked at it lying there on the desk between them. How much? He asked. You mean money? I asked how much. Not a cent, Nash said. I swear on everything I have left. Not 1 cent. He stood there for a moment, then raised a hand and rubbed his face. And when he lowered it, he looked noticeably older than he had when he'd walked into the room. My younger brother. He's 23. After the accident, the spring before last, he was in pain. They prescribed medication, and then he couldn't get off it. My family found a place for him, a treatment facility outside the city. He's getting better, boss. He calls me every week. He swallowed. That facility is funded by the Ashford Foundation. Enzo placed both hands on the desk. What does she have? Footage from one of the cameras there. From last month. He had a very bad week, and during that week he did something that, if someone wanted to, they could make public. Nash said, she didn't threaten me. She didn't have to. She just called me over and said she cared very much about the boy, that she hoped the facility would continue receiving funding, and then she asked whether you'd been asking many questions lately about the new maid. He gave a dry laugh. That was all. She didn't need to say another word. The study remained silent for a long time. Enzo thought about that file. He thought about medicine cabinets quietly closing whenever a certain woman walked past. He thought about the long table in his own kitchen surrounded by empty chairs. Every one of those things had begun with a few pages that had left this room in the hands of the man now standing before him. Do you know what happened to her afterward? Enzo asked. I know, Nash said, and his voice broke on the final word. I know they threw her and her sister out onto the street. I know her sister ended up in the hospital. I sat in my car outside that boarding house all morning that day, boss, and I didn't get out. He pointed to the ring on the desk. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know the rules of this house. Take it back. Enzo stood. He walked around the desk, and Nash Kettering straightened like a man already prepared for whatever was coming next. Enzo picked up the ring. He looked at it for a moment, turning it in his hand, then took Nash's hand, turned it palm up, and placed the ring in the center of it. Keep it. Nash stood frozen. Boss, I'm not finished, Enzo said, his voice still as quiet as ever. Tomorrow morning, you go see my attorney. You give a full statement about everything that happened, recorded and signed. Then when this goes to court, You go to court. You tell everyone there who gave what to whom, and why." Nash opened his mouth, then closed it again. "You're not firing me? What would firing you accomplish?" Enzo said. "You leave this house. Tomorrow there isn't a witness anymore, and that woman is still buried at the bottom of all this. If you want to make amends, there's only one way to do it. And it's much harder than taking off that ring and leaving it on my desk." He looked directly into Nash's eyes. "Dying is the cheapest way to escape responsibility. Walking away is no different. You don't get to choose the cheap way." Nash closed his hand tightly around the ring. "And as for your brother," Enzo continued, "starting tomorrow morning, that facility won't need Ashford money anymore. I'll take care of it. You tell him he stays there until he's finished, and no one is going to throw him out. And you tell him his brother is about to do something very difficult, so he knows what example to follow." Nash lowered his head. His shoulders shook once. Only once. Then he straightened again. He slid the ring back onto his finger. "When you go to court tomorrow, wear it," Enzo said. "Let them see it. Let them know who's telling the truth." Nash's statement opened a door Enzo hadn't thought to push on. The next morning, he ordered a complete audit of the Marchetti Foundation. Not the portion that was presented to him every quarter, but everything, beginning with the very first line. It took 4 days. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the auditor walked into the study, carrying a thick stack of papers, and wearing an expression Enzo had seen before on people who were about to deliver bad news to a man no one wanted to give bad news to. Money had been leaving the foundation for 18 months, not in one large withdrawal, but in many smaller ones, regular and carefully spaced, each one supported by legitimate paperwork, each one routed through an event planning company. There were 3 such companies. All 3 were registered at the same address, and when the ownership structure was traced back through the second layer, all 3 ended at the same name, Camilla Ashford. Enzo turned to the final page, where it clearly stated which program the money had been taken from. It was the fund designated for patients receiving dialysis and those waiting for organ transplants. The program his family had supported since his father's time. The same program the hospital board stood up every year and publicly thanked the Marchetti family for funding. He sat for a long time staring at the figure. Then he turned back several pages to the authorization form that allowed the event coordinator to approve expenses within a specified limit, and he looked down at the signature at the bottom. "I signed it," he said. The auditor looked up. "Sir, this is a standard authorization form. Nearly every family with a foundation like this." "I signed it," Enzo said again, "with my own hand. No one forced me. I gave her the key because I decided it wasn't worth my attention." He closed the file. "Put that in the record exactly as I said it. Don't soften a single word for me." The meeting took place Monday morning, in the same room with the long wooden table. The family counsel was there. The Marchetti attorney was there, along with 2 representatives from the auditing firm. The 3 largest donors to the foundation were present, as was the chairman of the hospital board. And the Ashford family was there, Camilla's parents seated across the table, with Camilla between them in an ivory suit, her hands folded neatly together, her chin slightly raised, because right up until the moment she entered that room, she still believed they were there to discuss the wedding. There was no screen. Nothing was projected onto the wall. Enzo simply pushed one set of papers after another along the table and let everyone read for themselves. Ledgers, bank statements, 3 company registrations showing the same address. Then, the attorney placed a small device on the table and played a recording the boarding house had retained in accordance with its own procedures. A woman's very polite voice speaking about responsibility and the safety of the other tenants. Camilla listened to half of it before reaching over and switching the device off. No one stopped her. No one needed to, because everyone in the room already knew what the rest would say. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she said, and her voice was still under control. "In front of my parents? I invited your parents so they could hear it from me," Enzo said, instead of hearing it from a federal prosecutor next week. Her mother raised a hand to her mouth. Her father didn't look at his daughter. He was reading the page in front of him very slowly, and the hand holding it was trembling. "You're choosing a servant over me?" Camilla said. She stood up. "I gave 2 years of my life to this family. I gave you my family name. I sat through dinners with people who wouldn't even have bothered answering your calls if it weren't for me." "No," Enzo said. He remained seated. He didn't raise his voice. "I'm choosing the truth, and you were never anything more than a name I intended to borrow. That was my mistake, and I've just admitted it in front of everyone sitting at this table." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out the engagement ring he'd been carrying with him for the past several days, and placed it on the table. The sound of metal touching wood was very small, but everyone in the room heard it. That money was meant for people standing in line waiting for a chance to stay alive, he said. You took it to pay for flowers and musicians. Then you picked up a telephone and had 2 sisters thrown out onto the street in the middle of February because one of them ruined a performance you were putting on. He stood. I won't lay a hand on you, and no one in my house will lay a hand on you either. The evidence has been with the federal prosecutor since this morning. Every agreement between my family and your family's bank was terminated before you entered this room. From this moment forward, what happens to you will be decided by the law, not by me. Camilla looked around the table. She looked at the 3 donors she'd shared dinner with more times than she could count. She looked at the chairman of the hospital board who had once kissed her hand at the spring gala. She looked at the older men of the Marchetti family, men who had always risen when she entered a room. Not one of them looked back at her. Not one of them spoke. Her mother sat motionless. Her father still held the paper in his trembling hand and never raised his head. And in that moment, Camilla Ashford understood something she'd never once considered in her life. That none of these people had ever truly stood on her side. They had only been standing near where she happened to stand. She picked up her bag and walked out of the room, and no one rose to see her out. It happened on Wednesday morning, in the 3rd-floor hallway of the hospital, where Adeline had just finished visiting Mrs. Rosaria and was on her way out. 2 people in plain clothes were waiting near the elevator, and one of them called her name. She stopped. They told her there was a complaint against her, that it concerned practicing medicine after her license had been revoked, and that she needed to come with them. Adeline didn't ask them to repeat themselves. She only set her bag down on the floor and asked one question, very softly. May I say one thing to the old lady in that room first? They told her no. She nodded. Then she held both hands out in front of her willingly. No one had to pull her forward. And when they closed the handcuffs around her wrists, her sleeves slipped down and revealed the 2 healed scars along her forearms. The hospital hallway was crowded at that hour. Several nurses pushing medication carts stopped where they were. 2 members of the emergency crew who had been at the Marchetti house that night were standing nearby, and one of them recognized her, opened his mouth as though he were about to say something, then stopped. A young doctor pressed himself against the wall to let them pass. Not one of them stepped forward. Adeline walked between the 2 officers down the hallway, her head held upright, her eyes fixed straight ahead all the way to the elevator. The evidence attached to the complaint came from the evening in the Marchetti Hall. The emergency response report had been submitted with it, clearly stating that an unlicensed person had performed chest compressions, rescue breathing, and had given medication-related instructions to medical personnel. Statements from 2 guests who had been present that night were included as well. There wasn't a single false word anywhere in the file. That was the cruelest part of all. Enzo learned what had happened at 10 o'clock that morning, and within an hour, his attorney had discovered who had filed the complaint. He read the name on his phone screen, then read it a second time. Then he drove to the house north of the city, where Ottavio Marchetti had lived alone since his wife died. His uncle was watering several potted plants in the sunroom when Enzo walked in, and he didn't look surprised. You got here faster than I expected. You did it. Yes. Ottavio set down the watering can. I did. Enzo stood still in the middle of the room. Sit down, son. I'll stand. As you like. The old man wiped his hands on the towel draped over the back of a chair. You want to know why? I'll save us both time and tell you. I have nothing against that girl. I've never spoken to her once. I don't have anything against her at all. He looked directly into his nephew's eyes. What I'm against is the weaker version of you she's turning you into. Enzo said nothing. You think I haven't noticed? Ottavio said. You broke with the Ashfords. You cut off 3 of the cleanest business interests this family has, and you did it in one morning, in front of the entire council. You let Kettering keep his ring after he betrayed you. You handed evidence against one of your own people to federal prosecutors with your own hands. Do you know what people out there have been saying about you all week? I don't care. I do. Ottavio struck the arm of the chair lightly with his hand. Your father left you a house, not a confessional. I only meant to wake you up. I thought if you had to spend your time rescuing a housemaid, you'd remember who you are. The car that night, Enzo said, on the road outside the estate. My men. He admitted it immediately, without evasion. I had them follow her to see who she was, where she went, who she met. Then your car blocked them at the intersection, and I told them to come back. I wasn't going to hurt her. His uncle watched him for a moment. Then his voice softened, almost pitying. Come on, this isn't difficult. I still have a few connections. One phone call to the right person, and by tomorrow morning that complaint disappears from the system as though it never existed. The girl is home before lunch. No one ever has to know. He raised one hand. That's how your father would have handled it. You know that. Enzo stood silent for a long time. He thought of a woman sitting on the floor of his laundry room with both hands pressed over her mouth so no one would hear her cry. He thought of the 4 years she'd allowed the entire world to believe a piece of paper. He thought of something his mother had told Ambrose, that if a woman like her accepted that kind of favor, she would spend the rest of her life standing beneath the person who gave it, never able to lift her head again. "No," he said. Ottavio blinked. "What did you say?" "I said no, Uncle." Enzo stepped forward. "If I save her that way, she'll owe me for the rest of her life. Every time she looks at me, she'll remember that her freedom came from one phone call made by the Marchetti family. I don't want her standing one step beneath me ever again." "Are you talking about feelings now?" "I'm talking about the fact that she did nothing wrong," Enzo said. "She knelt on the stone floor of our house and brought my mother back. If I have to use the back door to prove that, then I'm agreeing that what she did was wrong. I won't agree to that." The old man looked at him, and for the first time during the entire conversation, he truly looked old. "Your father wouldn't have done this." "No," Enzo said. "My father would have picked up the phone. Then he died before he turned 60, and you're the one who reminded me of that in our own meeting room." He reached the door, then stopped without turning around. "This time, our family is going to win with the truth, Uncle. I'll hire the best attorney in this state. I'll reopen the entire Cleveland case, and I'll walk through the front door. If that makes this family weaker, then call the council together and put it to a vote." Then he stepped outside into the February cold, and behind him, his uncle remained standing motionless among the potted plants, the towel still in his hand. The reopened hearing began on a late spring morning, in a small room with a long table and a flag hanging in the corner, and no reporters were allowed inside. Adeline sat in the respondents' row wearing the best blouse she owned, her hands folded together. This time she had an attorney, and this time she didn't refuse to make a statement. But the person who changed everything wasn't her. Halfway through the morning, a woman seated in the back row stood and asked permission to speak. She was nearing 40, still dressed in the nursing uniform she hadn't had time to change out of, and her hands trembled so badly that she had to place both of them flat on the table to steady herself. Marisol Vega told the entire story of that night again. She testified that she was the one who had entered the wrong dosage, not anyone else. She testified that when everything came apart, she had sat crying in the locker room and told her coworker that if the matter went any further, she would lose everything: her job, her license, and possibly even the right to remain with the 2 children waiting for her at home. She testified that her coworker had told her to go home, and by the following morning, the name on the record had been changed. She testified that for 4 years, she'd lived inside a home that someone else had paid the price to let her keep. Then she turned toward Adeline and said, "I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long." The board deliberated for 2 weeks. The decision arrived by mail, and inside was a sentence stating that Adeline Croft's nursing license had been fully reinstated, accompanied by the brief apology that administrative language permitted. The complaint concerning the night at the Marchetti house was dismissed immediately afterward. There was no miracle when it came to Josie. Marisol was tested, and she wasn't a match. But she didn't stop there. She enrolled in a paired donation program, one that allowed a person to donate even when they weren't compatible with the person they wanted to help, in exchange for that person receiving a place in a transplant chain. On the day she signed the papers, she said something to Adeline that she would remember for the rest of her life. "I can't give you the kidney, but I can give you a place in line." The transplant took place that summer. Josie made it through. Enzo came to visit on the afternoon. Adeline was packing her things to leave the hospital. He brought a small box, and inside was his mother's wedding ring, the ring Mrs. Rosaria had pressed into his hand and told him she had no daughter, only this. He didn't kneel. He simply placed the box on the table and said that he wanted her to stay. Not as a servant, not as someone who owed him a debt, but simply to stay. Adeline looked at the box for a long time. Then she closed the lid and pushed it back toward him. "The last time I lost everything, it was because I stepped forward in someone else's place," she said. "I don't regret it, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life standing behind anyone again. If I accept this now, then for the rest of my life I'll still be the woman you saved." She raised her eyes to his. "Give me 1 year. Let me learn to stand on my own feet first." Enzo Marchetti, the man no one in the entire city had ever dared refuse, picked up the box and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he lowered his head. "I can wait." 1 year later, the hospital's new care unit opened, built with the exact amount of money that had been recovered and with the additional funds supplied by the Marchetti family. Adeline Croft was there from early morning, in a white medical coat, and before welcoming a single guest, she stood by the back entrance to greet every member of her team. asking each one whether they'd slept well the night before and whether anyone needed to switch shifts. From the reading room at the end of the hallway came the laughter of several children arguing over the pictures in an oversized book. And that entire floor was filled that day with a kind of sound hospitals rarely had. Near noon, a newly hired server crossed the hall carrying a tray of water, caught her foot on the edge of a rug, and sent the entire tray crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass rang out sharply. The entire hall went silent, because among the people standing there were quite a few who still remembered what had happened in another hallway on a winter evening the year before. Adeline walked over. She didn't say anything. She knelt down, gathered the larger shards into her palm so no one would step on them, then looked up at the pale-faced girl. "Did you cut your hand?" The girl shook her head, tears already filling her eyes. "Then the most important part is over," Adeline said. "Bring me a broom, and we'll clean it up together." Behind her, Bess Kowalczyk, now a first-year nursing intern in that very unit, smiled and went to fetch the broom without needing to be told. A reporter invited to attend that day turned to Enzo and asked what had changed his household so completely, because people spoke about the Marchetti family very differently now than they had before. Enzo looked toward the woman kneeling on the floor, gathering broken glass. "The day kindness took the place of fear," he said. "And perhaps that is what this story was meant to leave behind as well. That dignity isn't something another person gives us. It isn't something found in the clothes we wear, or in the title people use when they speak our name. Dignity is something we choose to hold on to, even when our backs are against the wall, and not a single person steps forward to defend us. That kindness is never truly lost. It only travels a very long road before finding its way back, sometimes so slowly that we begin to believe it has forgotten the way home, and that the strongest person isn't the one who makes others afraid, but the one who teaches them that they never needed to be afraid in the first place." If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day we can have another story of kindness to listen to together. We'd truly love to hear how you feel about Adeline and the choice she made, so please leave a few words in the comments and share what is deepest in your heart. We wish you abundant health, happiness, and peace each and every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.